this morning, and we will go ahead and get ourselves started. And we may have another person or two show up. But this is our session number 10 of the Bible study, in which we are finishing out Deuteronomy. And just a quick note, in case there are some of you who are not able to stay through the end of the class today, next week there will be a Bible study offered, but it will not be in person because of some pre-scheduled meetings I have, and so there will be an introduction to Joshua and the first part of Joshua that will be a video. So I encourage you to go and watch that next week, and then we will be in person again 2 weeks from now, the first week in March.
When you say go and watch, what?
Yes. So on in the email every week, the newsletter, we have the video linked to in the newsletter, and so next week's newsletter will have the video introduction linked in the newsletter, so you can watch that way. All right, well, let's finish up Deuteronomy today. At the outset, there are not significant notes, and most of what I will cover are in the fun facts listed below. I will just note, however, that we do transition through the end of the middle part of Deuteronomy, the continued law giving, to the end section this week, which is Moses, in which Moses gives his final parting instructions, dies, and is buried. So if you remember last week when we were talking about the general outline of Deuteronomy, we have these three sections. There's kind of this introductory section that frames where the people are. They've arrived kind of on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They are prepared to enter into the promised land, and Moses is giving them some final instructions. We'll remember, too, that he was part of the people who were disobedient and wayward during the period of the Exodus, and so he is the last of the people who will not be allowed to enter the land. So essentially, upon his death, everybody in the gathered assembly are now part of the new generation that are authorized or allowed and blessed to enter into the Holy Land. And we will begin to sort of see that transition into the Holy Land in Joshua when we begin that book next week. This also brings us technically to the completion of the Torah, the books, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books ascribed to Moses's authorship, and we begin to transition into sort of solidly historical time as we move into Joshua. Now, I say that Joshua does function as a little bit of a kind of bridge book between the Torah and the very historical books, beginning with the books of Kings, the books of Chronicles, which we have very clear and solid evidence for the monarchical age in the life of the Israelites. We have material artifacts from those periods of time. Some of what we find in Joshua does have historical evidence to it. Some of it is mythic. For example, there's no clear evidence for a singular point in time destruction of walls of Jericho. Now, there are some walls that fell down and were rebuilt over different periods of time, but there's and to say too, to say there's this point in time destructive element, that's very hard to determine in a material way through archaeology. But we'll sort of talk about that. So Joshua has sort of a blending of mythic storytelling with very solid historical material. So we'll get into that next week. But we finished today Deuteronomy. So a brief outline here. Chapter 19, laws concerning refuge cities, property boundaries, and legal witnesses. Chapter 20 are rules of warfare. Chapter 21, a variety of laws concerning murder, female captives, firstborn children, and rebellious children. Chapter 22, laws regarding livestock, clothing, and sexual relations. Chapter 23, exclusions from the assembly and humanitarian precepts. Chapter 24, some additional general law giving. Chapter 25, instructions for Levirate marriage. Chapter 26, the tithe of first fruits and a final exhortation. Chapter 27, this inscription in Moab and the beginning of curses. And then chapter 28, additional blessings and curses. Chapter 29, the covenant renewed. Chapter 30, an exhortation to choose life. Chapter 31, Joshua's ascension to leadership and the instruction to read the law every seventh year. Chapter 32 is the Song of Moses. Chapter 33 is a final blessing on the Israelites. And chapter 34 is Moses' death and burial. So then moving into the fun facts. So going back, yes, Tim.
No, not go ahead.
Okay.
No, I don't have any comment yet.
Yep. Okay. Chapter 19, these first 11 verses, this is again a rather...
Hey, Father John, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yep.
In chapter 33,
Yes.
I was trying to count all the tribes and I only got 10. Aren't there 12? What am I missing?
Let's look at that real quick.
Or am I incorrect in that number?
Yeah, let me just pull up because I was not looking at that attentively. Chapter 33.
And maybe I miscounted, but like verse 6 was to Reuben, 7 was to Judah,
So
8 was to Levi.
Levi, yep. And
12 then was to Benjamin.
Yep.
13 to Joseph.
Yep. So remember that this is probably, well, no, and then 17, Ephraim and Manasseh are the two tribes from Joseph. So the...
Oh, so 17 is the Joseph people?
Yes, 17. So Joseph's tribe gets split between Ephraim and Manasseh. So who is excluded here? Dan, Naphtali, Asher. Let me look at my notes here.
Gad is number 20, verse 20.
Yep.
Well, if so Joseph, okay, is Ephraim, and so those are 10 and 12. I mean 11 and 12 then?
The traditional. Oh yes, Simeon. Okay, so here's what's missing. So Simeon is missing.
Okay.
Because of his sin in marrying. If we remember back, Simeon marries outside and he gets cursed for that marriage. But then Joseph gets split between Manasseh and Ephraim. So we drop the tribe of Simeon, but then Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, step in. So that's where we get the 12.
Okay.
So, okay.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So the first 11 verses here of chapter 19, this is again a rather forward-thinking allowance for the cultural context of the time. Provision is made for refuge cities to exist for those who inadvertently take the life of another. They still must live apart from the community because a violation has occurred, but they are given this place of refuge in which to continue to sort of live and exist. And we do not have evidence of other cultures in this time and in this age that had similar prescriptions. So no matter if a killing was done intentionally or inadvertently, the person is required to be put to death. So this is rather unique. Again, another thing, property, in ancient times, humans have experienced, or from ancient times, humans have experienced a challenge of communal versus private property. There's a very famous body of literature in psychology and economics, referred to as the tragedy of the commons. And it's sort of a recognition or a realization that very often throughout human history, when we have tried to share a communal resource, that resource ends up being depleted because everyone tries to maximize their benefit out of it. And so it's referred to as the tragedy of the commons, that when we try to communally hold something, we often degrade that resource because we're not good about sharing with one another. And so it's interesting that we have this very ancient prescription for recognizing individual property and this allowance for individual property to be maintained and safeguarded. So, and then 15 through 21, as was mentioned last week, the protocols necessitating multiple witnesses for the convicting of crimes is very novel in this time and in the cultural milieu in which they are existing. Accusations and convictions were more often determined by the power dynamics at play between the accuser and the accused. And I would note that still to this day is very true. Often as kind of blind as we attempt to make our justice system, it can very often be shaped significantly, or the outcomes of our justice system can be shaped by the power that the accused or the accuser is able to exercise in a given dispute. And so, we have very clear prescriptions here for how this is to be handled. And to this day, we are not very good at following them, just as Pam noted. So I lift this up as something for us to continue to kind of recognize as the ideal for which we are to live our lives. Chapter 20 as a whole. The articulation of acceptable rationales for war that are articulated here are not universally affirmed throughout the Old Testament text. We will see other frameworks for determining just warfare or just cause for conflict later on in the Old Testament. But for the time being, the protocols that are set forth here will be reaffirmed in Joshua and in the historical texts of the monarchical period that we will encounter in the coming weeks through the books of Kings, Chronicles, etc. So essentially, through more or less the period before the Babylonian exile, the prescription that Deuteronomy is setting here for how to determine what an acceptable rationale for war should be or is going to define several generations of life for the Israelites. So just from a kind of historical location, we can assume, as we talked about last week, that Deuteronomy in its final form is going to be written somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 to 800 BC. It begins to, or it continues to exist, and then, there's some sense in which it gets lost by the like 640s BC, and then it gets taken up again and is utilized pretty clearly in some of the prophetic literature through the Babylonian exile. So we can kind of assume that this prescription, this way of being for the Israelites, is in effect for somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 or so, maybe even 300 years. So it's not terribly dissimilar from the way that we still, to this day, kind of fundamentally orient our life around the Constitution, which is now approaching 250 years of utilization and usage. So, we can kind of see this in a similar timeline, that the utilization of this text as the kind of fundamental undergirding of the Israelites' life and the way that they are to be, in this kind of 200 to 250 year period. Things begin to shift a little bit when they return from the Babylonian exile in the 500s BC, and then lasting through the building of the Second Temple period and into the time of Jesus. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on as we get further into the Old Testament.
I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
Were there multiple copies of this when, if something happened and they needed to go to the lawyer, so to speak?
Yep. That's a great question. So the Israelites, from the material archaeological evidence we have, were fairly centralized around Jerusalem. There was a separate community that lived further away in the northern kingdom, and the Holy Land eventually gets split between the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. And so this gets a little bit confusing because terms get utilized in different ways at different times. And the northern kingdom is where Jesus eventually would come from, in Nazareth, and in what today is Galilee. But most of everyone would still have kind of oriented themselves around what was happening in Jerusalem. It is unclear as to how prolific texts were, but they would probably be fairly rare, because not only would everything have been transcribed by hand, but because these are law books, they would have had a specific kind of religious, they would have had a very spiritualized and kind of divine attribute set to them. And so there probably were more than one copy, but we would say a limited number of copies. And to this day, Judaism's a whole lot bigger in terms of numbers of adherents, but every Torah, so if you ever go to a Shabbat service and they process out the Torah that they read from, every Torah to this day is still written by hand. So there are Torahs that are used devotionally by Jews that would be more in a kind of printed book form. Just like the version of the Torah that I have, right here. So so this would be, and you always read Hebrew right to left. So this is actually the front of what we would think of as the back, is actually the front of the Torah. But I don't know if you all on video can see this in your little box in the corner. I'll stop sharing for just a second. But this is just like a printed copy of the scriptures, and a lot of even rabbis, scholars will use this for study purposes, but for liturgical purposes, you always use a handwritten version. So it would be similar to us. We always have fancy lectern Bibles for liturgical worship. Imagine if all of those lectern Bibles were still transcribed by hand today. I mean, that's how Torah is. So that tradition goes back to ancient times. But yeah. Okay. Chapter 20 as a whole. This is the articulation of acceptable rationales for war. Oh no, we just talked about that. So that was the war giving. All right, chapter 21. As problematic as this utilitarian and objectifying treatment, sorry, that's supposed to be treatment, treatment of female captives is here, and as disorienting as it would be for us in this modern age, these rules are again radically protective of the women and safeguarding them from being taken advantage of or being taken further advantage of. Once they've been captured, this is the way you are to treat them. And if you are ready to dispose of them, you can't just like let them go. You can't just cast them away. You have to treat them in this prescribed manner. And then immediately following that, these verses 15 through 17, this interesting codification of the rights of the firstborn has other regional similarities. For example, there is some discussion of firstborn children in the very ancient Code of Hammurabi. But as we've seen in previous parts of Torah, this is not always followed to the exact letter of the law. So it's interesting. And this is a good example of where we very likely have the voice of the priestly class wanting to set down a rather rigid prescription for what these inheritances are going to look like, what the rights of the firstborn are going to look like. And then we have within, for lack of a better term, the narrative or mythic literature of the Old Testament, numerous examples where this isn't followed, where there's some kind of underhandedness, where Jacob steals the birthright of Esau, for example, or Joseph, one of the youngest of the sons, is elevated in Israel's eyes. That Jacob has as his son the most beloved being Joseph. So there are counter narratives here. I'll mention this just a little bit further down. I'll go ahead and just say it now, though. I mentioned here the Code of Hammurabi. This is the earliest, some of you may know this. This is the earliest law giving that we have anywhere in the world. It is on a set of stone tablets communicating the law giving in the Babylonian culture at that time. And it dates to somewhere around 1700 BC. So we're talking 1,000 years earlier than the text of Deuteronomy. So very, very ancient. And a lot of Near Eastern cultures have some relationship to some of those earlier cultural touch points, like the Code of Hammurabi. So, chapter 22, verse 5, the prohibition here against supposed cross-dressing is very likely driven by the same quote-unquote setting apart from other regional cultures and cultic practices that has so often underlaid the other rather specific and very precise rule setting that we have seen in other parts of Torah law. So one thing that scholars have debated or I guess that separated out. So there are some scholars, especially some Christian scholars, who want to kind of take everything as a whole and to say, we're not going to differentiate between one set of law giving and another because this is all rules that God has given us, and we just have to observe them as a whole without regard to context or without regard to setting or without regard to the genesis of why this law was given. If it was given, it was given, and we have to abide by it. Whereas I would suggest from my perspective that a majority of rabbinical scholars, so a majority of rabbis and Jewish thinkers, have historically had a much more nuanced perspective, and a much more circumspect perspective. So there are certain laws that seem to be kind of fundamental to the relationship that God is setting with the Israelites and with his chosen people. And some of these things we can see for their practicality, for the practical purposes. So a lot of the admonitions, for example, against kinship sexual relationships, the closeness, determining what constitutes closeness. We know that there are genetic problems with incestuous relationships. We know, right? We know now that there are specific reasons why you want to avoid sexual relationships with close kin. And so it makes sense that they would have had some kind of framework for understanding that. When we look at all of the prescriptions in Leviticus around the skin conditions, we know that a lot of that stuff can be transmitted by close contact with one another. So it makes practical sense that there would be some sort of law ascribing why you would separate out certain people. If you have someone who tends to have kind of a hot-headedness, and maybe they inadvertently kill someone, even if they didn't intend it, maybe they should be living apart from the community. There's some really practical senses for why some of these things happen. But then there are other things like the cross-dressing, like the admonitions against same-sex relationships, that seem to be more driven by a sense that we need to be unique and in some way stand apart from the other cultures that are around us. And so it's not so much a matter of cross-dressing being somehow a unhealthy or problematic behavior within human culture as a whole, but it's that in this time, this cultural moment, this milieu that the Israelites are existing, this is part of a cultic practice that other groups are participating in, and this is a way for us to be clearer about our distinction from them and our separate identity from them. And so some rabbis will sort of give more weight to certain prescriptions than others because they want to kind of contextualize some of these things. And so there are multiple perspectives on these, but I offer that as a way of saying that it's not so clear and dry that God prohibits cross-dressing, that God just says cross-dressing is never okay and no one should ever do it throughout time in history. That there is an alternative way of looking at this, or an alternative way of looking at some of the prescriptions, for example, around same-sex relationships that can be seen as more culturally conditioned for the point of time in which these rules were given, not so much universally applied, or the expectation that they would be universally applied throughout all time and space. But that's a contested, debated point. So I acknowledge that there's some difference of opinion on those things.
I'm sorry. Is this a passage that might be quoted when somebody's trying to say that God doesn't permit homosexuality?
Oh, absolutely.
But
absolutely.
What about the fact that we're people of the new covenant?
Right. And we will, yep.
People of the new covenant.
Yeah, like what do we do with the fact that Jesus sort of seems to challenge some of these same prescriptions? How do we reconcile some of these kind of harsh languages that we hear, some of these harsh prescriptions that we hear in the Old Testament, with what Jesus seems to indicate about God's identity in the New Testament? And that's precisely for me where I think there's some helpfulness with the rabbinic tradition of saying, some of these prescriptions are more a matter of God setting his people apart in this particular time and location, not that it is this universally expected prohibition that will always exist for all time and all place. Just some food for thought there.
It does seem odd that this specific law is here, though, when I don't know, in my opinion, it would seem that you would see specific rules against pagan rites that would
Right.
be more concerning to Moses and the elders at the time, as since we see so many passages of God saying, "I'm a jealous God," kind of,
Yes.
and worship no other gods before me. That particular commandment, it seems to be more why this is here. It really struck me again, like the passage about that seems to indicate the non-acceptance of homosexuality. And I was wondering, does this, within the Jewish tradition, does this get blown up in our day? Does this get blown up into a non-acceptance of transgender?
Yeah.
Because if they, well, he's cross-dressing, that's a precursor to wanting to have the same sex in modern times. And so this is the prescription says you can't do that, and so we don't allow it. Is that so? I'm not familiar with arguments in that.
Yeah. Great question, Tim. And the best answer I can give to that is that it's not wholly one or the other. Just like for us in Christianity, there are a number of denominations, for lack of a better term, of Judaism. So in the United States, there are sort of three main branches: Orthodox, conservative, and Reformed. And that sort of is on a spectrum from most conservative in terms of kind of how they interpret the law and how they abide by the law to most progressive or liberal. So Orthodox Jews tend to be very observant, tend to have very kind of concrete attitudes about how these things are to be adhered to and how they are to be followed. And they are very concerned with, very, very kind of, and this may be a little bit of a judgment on my part, but I would say it's fair to say they are very concerned with minutia. So, what exact prayers you are to say in what given circumstances, what kinds of prayers you are to adhere to. I'll give you an example. When I fly over to the Holy Land, I often fly out of Newark, which has a very large Orthodox population. And there will be folks on the flight who are getting up at prescribed times to pray in the aisles because, and they have to calculate, okay, I am flying, so therefore my time is shifting because I'm going from one place to the next. So I have to figure out down to sort of this precise minute when I'm supposed to stand up and say these prayers, because it's a little bit uncertain since we're in the air and we're moving across time zones so rapidly. And so they get really, really concerned with kind of following those things. On the other end of the spectrum, Reformed Jews, they've become a little bit more conservative over the course of their life. But when they first kind of became a tradition in the early 20th century, they were going so far as to actually holding their Shabbat services on Sunday mornings instead of Saturdays, because they wanted to kind of reflect the given culture in the United States, predominantly being Christian. There's not the prescription in Reform Judaism that you have to absolutely follow kosher laws. As a Reformed rabbi friend of mine once said, he said, I tell my congregation you don't have to follow these things, but don't bring a ham to the Passover Seder, right? Like, just be sensitive, but and so there are Reformed rabbis who are women. There are Reformed rabbis who are transgender. There are Reformed rabbis who are across the LGBTQ spectrum. And then there's kind of a more nuanced or a more complicated picture when it comes to the conservative adherents, which is sort of the middle path in U.S. Judaism, and then the Orthodox. But even among the Orthodox, there are some Orthodox groups that I don't know of any Orthodox groups that ordain women to the rabbinate, but there are Orthodox groups that are very strict about law adherence and yet have more nuanced perspectives on human sexuality, on transgender identity. So I would say, as a whole, all expressions of Judaism, even the really kind of observant forms of Judaism, in the main, they tend to be much more circumspect and much more nuanced in their engagement with the law, that the law continues to be a living tradition that we wrestle with, that we debate, that we study and we nuance, that we wrestle with God in this. I've talked about that several times. Whereas we as Christians, especially Western Christians, have a long, millennia long tradition going back to the Middle Ages of being obsessed with having the right answer in a right frame in this sort of box that we can tie up with a neat little bow. And that's just not really been a part of the Jewish tradition as a whole. So anyway, okay. Does that kind of answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, all right, chapter 22, verse 5. The prohibition here, that's what we just talked about. Chapter 22, verses 9 through 11. This can be seen as an admonition against humans playing God, as it were, by combining things that are not naturally occurring. So there's some debate around exactly why there are these specific prohibitions, but the sense was that by a lot of scholars is that this is sort of a recognition of, these things naturally occur in this way in the world. We are not God. Who are we to try to manipulate things to create these new fabrics, these new substances, these new ways of being? And to this day, there are whole industries of especially observant Jews around making the textiles to accommodate a practice of not blending these fabrics. That was one reason why there was such a large presence of Jewish folks in the textile industry in New York and in New England in the early parts of our history. They have a long history of working in textile industries. And then you know what? I didn't make this as a note, but I will also mention, I didn't get the chapter down, but the prescriptions around lending money. So that's another example somewhere, and I don't actually know the history of this. This is something I should look up and bring back to you all. At some point, fairly early on in the Christian tradition, there is a sense that simony, the lending of money, is not permissible. That it violates the laws of God, and yet there is this allowance by the Old Testament for the Israelites and later the Jewish people to be able to lend to non-Jews, and so that is one reason why European Jewry became as involved in the financial industry as they did, because they had an allowance to lend and to manage money when Christians were prohibited from doing so. This sort of develops into a historical reality in the European context. Okay.
Was it that the thing about simony that they couldn't lend money for interest, right?
Correct, but to themselves. They could lend at interest to non-Jews.
Okay.
That's what it's, yeah, and I need to go back and look at where that is specifically. But yes, the prohibition against lending at interest was just within the community, and then they could lend to others who are outside of the community at interest. But I don't know why there's a blanket prohibition in Christianity. I don't know exactly why that became the case. Okay, chapter 23, these first 8 verses. It's important to note here that the assembly is assumed to just be the male members of the gathered Israelites. This would exclude women, children, and foreigners. And then in most of chapters 24 and 25, as difficult as some of these laws and regulations have to, yes, Pam?
What exactly does the assembly do?
It is unclear. That's a great question. So this actually becomes more of a question as it develops we'll see in Joshua, and then some of the historical books in Kings and Chronicles, because they don't do the same thing all the time. And there are moments where the assembly is sort of gathered and they're kind of like, what do we do? What is our role? And that becomes a part of what is wrestled with. There's a moment in time where the assembly sort of says we can't conduct our own affairs, so we need a series of judges to help reconcile these divisions and these conflicts that we have among ourselves. And then, the assembly gets together and say, we don't really like the judges. We really need a king. And God says, no, you don't need a king. You don't want a king. And they say, yes, we want a king. And so then he gives them a king, and then the kings don't work out. So the assembly's presence kind of shifts and fluctuates over time. Interestingly, just as a kind of narrative function, the assembly is often kind of the foil to God's plans. The assembly is, for lack of a better term, they're kind of bitching and moaning about their condition and how they think things should go, and they seem to have this sort of presence of complaint throughout the Old Testament. So, but it's not.
God is where they reach a consensus, or
what's that?
God is where they.
Yes, right. God is sort of yes. So it's this kind of it's complicated, and it's not delineated in a very clear fashion. So that's a great question, Pam, because it's not explicitly developed.
Because I figured it was the heads of all the tribes kind of deciding now it is we're all going to live together. I thought it was more like a government thing rather than a church thing.
And it seems to function that way. But remember, there's not a separation between the governance and the religious elements, right? So government and the governance, let me put it that way, the governance and the religious life are intertwined. They are not separate experiences within the Israelite community. And so it all is of a piece. We will hear in Joshua this example where Joshua is leading worship with the assembly in a way that is somewhat similar to some things that we continue to do in this present age. And we'll talk about that actually in 2 weeks' time, because it's the second half of Joshua. But it's both kind of law and worship. The two are kind of hard to parse apart. So
is it Is this the basis of the exclusion of women from clergy?
It's one element, and then especially for Christians, the unfortunate language that Paul uses in a number of his epistles to communities about women needing to be subservient to men, they need to be quiet and not speak in public. That often for conservative Christian groups is where they draw that, but yeah.
It seemed like the assembly was also acting as a court, and they were
Yes,
judging.
they have, right.
You know, stone them with stones. I want to be sure you're stoned with stones.
With stones, right.
You don't have no
So,
stones today, sorry.
yep.
Find some mud.
Yeah, but it is in the ambiguity of this as we get into the historical books, the ambiguity in Deuteronomy, even as clear as it is on some prescriptions, the ambiguity here is where there's going to be this tension of okay, we're struggling to live this out. We need a better framework for doing this. This better framework needs to be a set of judges, or it needs to be a monarch, or it needs to be that, or this, or something else. So this isn't a settled issue, and we're actually going to confront it again very shortly because it's unclear. So
in 23:2, when it says those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted, what is an illicit union?
It could be all sorts of things, but most often in this context, it probably would have been like an intermarriage between an Israelite and someone from another culture. There are a variety, but that would have been the most common violation. Someone born out of a strict sort of Israelite.
Is it just Orthodox Jews that consider their child dead if they marry outside of the Jewish religion?
That's a good question. I don't know. That is certainly the case for really observant Jews, but I don't know how that is how that's experienced. I will give you one quick thing that I do know is that for conservatives, I'm not exactly sure where Orthodox are on this, but for conservatives, if you're part of a interfaith union, if you're the child of an interfaith union, if your mother is Jewish, then you are still considered Jewish. So even if your father is a non-Jew, if your mother is Jewish, you are considered Jewish. Right. For Reformed Jews, it can be either parent, even though and I believe this is true, by the state of Israel, in order to qualify for citizenship, you have to either convert, which you can convert and become Jewish, or you have to prove your matrilineal lineage as a Jew. So for the state of Israel, if you are, let's say a guy I went to college with, his father was Jewish, his mother was Christian, he was raised in a Reformed Jewish home, identified as Jewish throughout his whole life, but in order to go on his birthright and in order to receive citizenship in the state of Israel, he technically had to convert because his father was Jewish and not his mother.
Is that because that's the only way they can prove that they're Jewish? They can't prove anything about the father. He can say he's the father.
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure why that's the case. But from very early on, and I don't know where, I'd have to go back and look, but from very early on, there's been a matrilineal inheritance in Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
So
proof positive.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So chapters 24 and 25, as difficult as some of these laws and regulations have seemed to us as modern readers and hearers, these two chapters show the other side of this law giving, the extended provision for care for the poor and needy, the discourse on the Levirate marriage, which in essence is a strong protection for widows without children to care for them, are all incredibly radical and generous for the time and cultural context of the age. Even now, again, as Pam was talking about at the beginning, even now these prescriptions can be difficult for some in our society to hear, with our attitudes towards personal freedom and the kind of American, quote unquote, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality, which I will note has always struck me as ironic, because as someone who's worn boots my entire life, it is impossible to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So I'm not exactly sure why that became the kind of term that we like to use, because it's sort of acknowledging that it can't be done. So even in using that as a pithy statement, it's kind of an impossibility. So, yep. All right. Chapter 26, verses 1 through 15, referencing back to chapter 14, I'll note that nothing is said here about 10%, which I mentioned last week. Chapter 14 is one of the very, very few places in all of Scripture where a set amount of 10% is mentioned. This is very rarely discussed in Scripture. The tithe here seems to be framed around the guarantee of future fruitfulness, and again has less emphasis on the spiritualized importance that we saw in chapter 14. So chapter 14 is kind of the spiritual centeredness of tithing, whereas now that we're in chapter 26, we're back to this sense that tithing or offering is in relationship to future fruitfulness, not as much of a spiritual discipline as this kind of practical process for making sure that we remain in God's good graces. So, chapter 26.
Well, I have a quick question.
Yep. Go ahead.
Verse 12, when you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the third year, which is the year of the tithe, giving it to the Levites, aliens, orphans, widows, and so on.
Right.
So does that mean you only have to tithe every third year?
So what verse was that again?
12.
Verse 12. When you have finished paying all the tithe for your produce in the third year, which is the year of the tithe, giving it to the Levites. Yep. Then you shall say before the God, I have removed the sacred portion from the house and I've given it to the Levite. Yep. That's a good question. I don't actually know. Let me see if I have any notes on that.
Or is it that's the year you give it away
right.
to the Levites, the aliens, the orphans, and the widows?
Yep. So 12. Okay, so 1 through 11 is a sort of general prescription on this tithe of the first fruits. 12 through 15 is a second, this is the note I have here, is a secondary form of tithe that is the every third year tithe that has a specific allotment to it. So sort of like we tithe throughout the year, but then, in Lent and Advent, we have specific appeals that go to specific purposes. So, you have this general first fruits tithe that happens every year. And then you have on the third year, the specific tithe that's set aside for this specific purpose of the foreigner, the widow, etc. So.
Okay. Are their years different than our years?
Yes. So they are operating on a lunar calendar. So they are not. It is not a 365-day year in the same way we have it. I looked this up at one point and I have forgotten, but it is a little bit shorter. So like a year is more like 10 months as opposed to like 12, like 10 of our months or 10 and a half of our months. So the years accumulate faster than our years accumulate.
I'm sorry, I have to go. I have another Zoom.
Yep.
See
All
you
right.
guys.
Take care, Pam. So,
See
okay, and then verse 5, we hear this reference to Aramean. Aramean denotes northern Syrian ancestry and is a connection back to Abraham, but also this language of the wanderer is often a descriptor in reference to Jacob as well. So this kind of heritage of being, again, we've talked about this, but the hearkening back to a part of the tradition, being nomadic, being wanderers, that this is part of that tradition as well. And then chapters 27 and 28, the etching of law giving in stone is a very ancient Middle Eastern practice. As I mentioned earlier, the Code of Hammurabi, which dates to the 1,000 years before we're talking about Deuteronomy. And then the series of curses and blessings here are all tied to the observance of Torah law. Additionally, especially in chapter 28, we see this parallelism of balancing the blesses and the curses, balancing one thing with another, and that becomes very common in the in part of the Jewish tradition. We'll see it in the New Testament with Jesus. He often plays with this parallelism, but one of the clearest examples that kind of connects to this series of cursings and blessings is the way in which the Beatitudes are structured, because we have blessed are and woe to, so it's here are, the people that are blessed, here are the people who are, he doesn't use, the strong language of cursed, but here are the people for whom, they are not in good standing with God because of the ways that they're treating themselves. And if you look, there's a balancing of those who are blessed with their sort of opposing side being the ones who are being cursed or are being rejected. So for their behaviors. 30 verses 11 through 14 is a restatement of the basic law. God is with you, very near to you, and the law is in your mouth and on your lips. Observe it with the wholeness of your being. 31 verse 2, Moses' age reflects the maximum lifespan suggested elsewhere in the Old Testament. This is mentioned in Genesis 6:3 and Job chapter 42 verse 16. And in the tradition of the Jewish culture at the time, this would have been seen as the span of 3 normal living generations. So Moses is kind of the last of these long-lived individuals. We get into what we would sort of think of as more normal lifespans as we move into Joshua and then into the historical books of Kings and Chronicles. Chapter 31, verse 16, this is an indication of God's foreknowledge that the people will slip and fall back into sinful practices again in the future. We begin to see, as I talked about in the Western Christian tradition, this obsessiveness with kind of figuring out the exact nature of all of these things. There are a set of attributes that become ascribed to God, and you probably have heard these. They are referred to as the omnis, that God is omnipotent, all-powerful. God is omnipresent, everywhere. God is omniscient, all-knowing. And this is an example of the sense that God is omniscient. So even as God is recognizing the covenant status with the Israelites, he is recognizing that Moses is about to die. He's also telling Moses, I know the people are going to fall again. I know that there's, that their observance is not going to last. There's going to be these times where things slip and they slip up. So, and then finally, most of chapters 32 and 33 these are, and we will see this again even in the New Testament, these are likely very ancient liturgical texts, like hymns or litanies that would have been ascribed to Moses and used in worship by the Israelites. This is very likely some of the earliest liturgical material that we have in the Bible. And by that, I mean not things, they would have been reading Torah, they would have been studying it or reciting it as part of ritual observance. But in terms of other elements of liturgy, like things that would have been sung or recited as elements of the worship, that scholars are fairly universally agreed that these would have been ancient liturgical texts that get incorporated into the end of Deuteronomy. And then finally, chapter 34. If we remember from last week that Deuteronomy in particular, but the Torah as a whole, is seen as the living Moses that will remain with the people after his death. This burial in a place that cannot be found is a way of keeping the Israelites focused on the living legacy, the living Torah, the living law, and not on the veneration of a location in which he is buried, and sort of, preventing the people from saying, well, now Moses is dead, we don't have to listen to any of this anymore, we can move on and do our own thing. This is kind of a way of saying, no, Moses remains with you, Moses remains the authoritative voice, and Moses is now within the living Torah, not this point in time death in this particular location. So.
Well, they're lucky that he dropped the third tablet.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right.
We're lucky that he did what?
Drop the third tablet. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
I bring you the 15.
So. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Tim. Any comments or thoughts on your end?
I think Pam had to leave, John, for her meeting at 11.
Oh, yeah. No, I was asking Tim if you had any.
Okay, yeah, I just have one comment. What's separate verses 32 and 33, or chapters 32 and 3? Those read like Psalms to me, and I was just wondering what. Maybe we'll talk about this later. We get to Psalms, but why are those recorded? What makes these different than what get recorded in the book of Psalms, or are they just? I mean, why they appear here as opposed to just being part of Psalms?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So it's probably the age. So we know for a fact that the Deuteronomy as a text was more or less set by the 700s BC, whereas the vast majority of the Psalms are going to come a couple of hundred years later. So they are later texts. They existed. They were written and authored at different times. And these are again ascribed to Moses. So these you're exactly right. Like they have a kind of poetic quality to them, a hymn quality to them. And these are ascribed though to Moses. So these would have been the hymns received from Moses, whereas the tradition is that David was the psalmist. So the Psalms are ascribed to David. So there are two different authorships as well. Yeah. But thanks. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, friends. I will see you all in person in 2 weeks. So, okay. Yep. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care, Tim.
See you, everyone.